jumping on. I'm gonna wait a couple more, or maybe a minute more at the most. And as I see more people jumping on, but just want to first thank everybody for being on right now. It's been a great turnout throughout this whole month of May. Well over 100 signups on each one of the seminars, and Eric Weber wanted to just relay thanks for everybody jumping on, as well as please we're thinking about doing another series of 3 or 4 like we just did, but looking for suggestions from you guys. What else you'd like to hear about? What type of topics? Any speakers you're interested in listening to? Anything that we've talked about already that you want to expand on? Please let us know. We'll have some information at the end that you can get a hold of us. But think about that. So throughout the talk here today, if you have some questions, you can do a couple different options. Number one, you can send a Q&A, which I already got one question already this morning. And the question was, are we recording this? And the answer is yes, we are recording it. And there will be a link after this that we'll send out. So anybody that wants to listen to this later on or pass it on to anybody else, they can. We'll be sending out that link at the end. But you can send questions throughout. And I'll be looking at those and have Thompson, if I feel that it's a good timing, I might ask those questions in the middle. If not, then I will wait till the end and send them out. Also, if you have a question and you see something on the screen that you want to go back, you can raise your hand, and I'll also go back and try to see if I can have you ask that question as well. And we'll get started here. One last question that I did see that came up. Yes, the previous ones are already recorded and been posted, so you can contact Woodway for those, for any of the previous ones. So good start with the questions. Love it. So I'm going to let Thompson take it from here. I've worked with him for a couple of years now on anything to do with the Wattbike. So all the teams that I work with, I have him speak to the teams on how to use and get the most out of the Wattbike. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. So Thompson, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Can you guys hear me all right?
I think we're good.
Perfect. So thank you for tuning into the Woodway educational series of webinars. We've been very fortunate to have great turnouts for these, as Paul has mentioned. So today's webinar is going to be about OffFeet testing and training. OffFeet conditioning has been a popular topic lately. So we're going to dive into some of the other possibilities as far as protocols that can be followed OffFeet. So OffFeet protocols involve testing and training the sport's energy system demands without stressing the athlete's mechanical structure. So what does that mean? Ultimately, we want to figure out exactly what we can do to get the most out of our athletes without putting themselves in stressful situations or situations in which they could see harm to their mechanical structure. So key performance indicators. These are essentially measures that are used to evaluate performance in sports. Now, every coach has these. Many athletes, if they're self-coached, have these as well. These are specific exercises, movements, or tests that they perform on a regular basis to evaluate how their training is going and how they're progressing. Now, some of these qualities are general in nature. So those could be anything from strength, power, speed to aerobic capacity, or even body composition. And some of those are much more sport specific. So if you're a hockey player, that's your skating and puck handling ability. And if you're a soccer player, those are your foot skills and your ball handling skills. Ultimately, each coach is going to choose which exercises are going to yield the best indication for performance within the athlete's specific sport. So it doesn't necessarily matter which KPIs your team is using. The most important thing is that you have them and you're keeping track of them regularly. Ultimately, with those key performance indicators, you're going to be developing a performance matrix. So the performance matrix is a series of qualities or a web of qualities that'll allow you to gauge how you're progressing in all your different areas of fitness or different physical qualities and abilities. Those qualities could be relative strength, anaerobic capacity, lower body power, change of direction. So those could be cone drills or anything sprint related, especially if you're a ground-based athlete, or general aerobic capacity as in your general physical preparedness. Ideally, we'd like to be able to assess multiple physical qualities with minimal equipment requirements. So what does that mean? Ideally, we want one tool or as few tools as possible to be able to provide results or data for those performance indicators. We need a tool that's accurate, repeatable, and reliable that we can use on an ongoing basis to evaluate how successful our training program is. High power equals high risk potential. So as Paul has discussed in his previous webinars, the more powerful an athlete is, and ultimately the more impactful situations they're putting themselves in, the higher the risk of injury. So one of the biggest things for ground-based athletes these days is managing load, predominantly pertaining to accelerations and decelerations. These impose a lot of stress on the athlete's body. So if you're a basketball player and you're jumping and running down the court all day, or if you're a football player and you're making contact all the time, ultimately we need to figure out how much is just enough to maintain the required adaptations without too much. So we want to minimize the risk, give yourself just enough time to develop the qualities within the connective tissues, ligaments, tendons, and joints to be able to stay safe, healthy, perform well without overdoing it. So the objective is to develop a training method which allows the athlete to develop all the physical qualities required in their sport while minimizing the risk exposure. So what are some of the different off-feet training modalities out there? Free weights are probably one of the most popular ones. That could be anything from barbell, kettlebell, or dumbbell complexes and circuits to battling ropes, swimming or aquatic training, or rowing ergometers. Now, with free weights, the implements themselves don't provide any real-time feedback. And what I mean with that is you only have one major data parameter, and that's the load that you're using. There's a bunch of different movements that you can perform with free weights. However, none of those movements, unless you're using machines, have a defined range of motion. So if you're doing a squat or a deadlift or a thruster, those movements are going to be individualized based upon your limb lengths. And they're also going to be relatively open-ended in the sense that you're now locked into a particular movement pattern. With the battling ropes, you can use those for time. However, you only have one or maybe a small range of resistances to use, only a few movements to choose from, and you're not getting any real-time data from the ropes. You only have that timer to go off of. With swimming and aquatic training, those typically have higher technique requirements than most of the other off-feet training modalities. So unless you're a very technically proficient swimmer, you're going to have a hard time cross-training for any ground-based sport in the swimming pool. If you're doing sprint drills in the water, those definitely have a time and a place. However, again, you're not seeing any real-time feedback from that movement unless you're using motion capture, timing, and a few other external tools that most people don't have access to. The rowing ergometer is probably one of the best tools for showing a lot of data within a relatively limited setting. It'll provide speed, it'll provide time, it'll even provide a power output. However, you're only experiencing partial time under tension. So there's a concentric phase to the movement, but there's no eccentric phase, and you have to go through this reset phase where no tension is being applied, which means that you're, in essence, missing out on a good portion of training time. Also, some of these open-ended movements require a higher level of technique, which means unless you're a very technically proficient rower, you might not be able to get the most out of the exercise without running into some other challenges. You might experience a lot more muscular fatigue than cardiorespiratory fatigue. And depending upon what your training or testing objective is, that might kind of mitigate the effect of what you're trying to accomplish. So what's the advantage of cycling training? The Wattbike advantage is that you're locked into a 360-degree concentric. So you're always under tension. However, it is always concentric tension. So you're always pushing. Despite the constant pushing nature of the exercise, however, there's multiple different changes in emphasis on the muscles. So through the 4 phases of the pedaling revolution, you see a pushing phase, transitional phases over the bottom and the top of the revolution, and a pulling phase as you reset back to the push. So you can get a lot of work done without any rest during the exercise. It also has a fixed range of motion. Obviously, crank arm length isn't going to change as you're riding. On the Wattbike, the crank arm length is a standard 170 millimeters. So this is the same across every single Wattbike in the world. And the reason for that is repeatability. If we're going to be testing athletes in multiple different states or countries, we want to make sure that every test is going to be able to be conducted in the same exact manner. So it's 170 millimeter crank arm length. Riding a bike is a relatively simple movement in the sense that once you require the basic skills, as long as you're able to maintain constant force application, that range of motion isn't going to change. And we're able to capture all of that force information that's put into the bike. The Wattbike has a very high force sampling rate. It captures force at a rate of 100 times a second. So we can ensure that every ounce of energy that you're putting into the bike is going to be measured. So about the Wattbike. It has a racing-inspired geometry. The Wattbike was originally developed as a talent identification and testing tool with British cycling. So they wanted a bike that felt like a real bike, that was able to provide very accurate and reliable data, that had a very smooth sensation. So the bike uses a combination of air and magnetic resistance, both of which are independently adjustable. The bike has the ability to freewheel, which means that it has the ability to coast. This is both a safety feature and a technical development feature. You'll notice that if you're coasting, you're not doing any work and you're not developing anything. So we want to make sure that all of the force that you're putting into the bike has to be applied in the proper direction to create some sort of development. The power meter, again, has a high force sampling rate. So we're able to capture every ounce of input that's being put into the bike, which is particularly helpful for some of the shorter efforts. So the pedal revolution phases. On the screen right now, you'll see the Wattbike polar view, which is a proprietary metric that you'll see on the Wattbike display and on the Wattbike Hub app. The pedaling phases, contrary to popular belief, are multiple in nature. There's not just one phase, there's not just a push, there's a pulling phase and transitional phases over the top and the bottom of the revolution. So most ground-based athletes are accustomed to pushing through the pedal revolution. So you'll see a lot of football players, soccer players, even hockey players, when they're on a bike, they'll focus predominantly on the pushing phase without worrying as much about pulling up and resetting. And when you're only focused on the pushing phase of the pedaling revolution, you're missing out on a lot of work that could be done. So in the polar view image on the left, you'll see a pinch in the middle. And that pinch in the middle is the force curve, and it's showing just the pushing phase of the revolution. The dead spot in the middle, where the image comes together, is the transition over the top and the bottom of the pedal revolution. So if you're just pushing, you're going to see a heavy pinch in the middle of your polar view image, which indicates that you're not capitalizing on the opportunity to produce force all the way around the 360-degree revolution. The middle image shows a slight opening of the center of the polar view. So the transitions are starting to smooth out a little bit, and there's starting to be some force applied through the pulling phases. And the far right image is the quote unquote optimal pedaling technique. So this is essentially the technique of an elite level cyclist after careful studying by our sports scientist and development of the pedaling effectiveness score and polar view image. This shows that force is being applied all the way around the pedal revolution. Obviously, there's still more force being applied through the pushing phase than the pulling phase, However, it's starting to even out much more than in the first image. Now, in order to create an image like that, you need to be able to apply pressure in every direction of the pedaling revolution. So that means that you have to be locked in or unified with the pedal. You need to either use a cycling specific shoe or a tennis shoe with a toe cage, something that allows you to exert force all the way around the revolution rather than just stomping on the pedals. If you're not secured into the toe cages or you're not locked into the cycling pedal and cleat mechanism, you're not going to be able to exert force through phases 3, 4, and even the beginning stage of force 1. So when we're using the Wattbike, it makes sense to simplify the areas of focus. Ultimately, there's 3 primary areas that we can focus on. There's alactic anaerobic exertion, there's lactate capacity, and there's aerobic capacity. And these are obviously highly generalized. This is ultimately to illustrate a force. The force that we're trying to exert in a peak power test is going to be short and maximal. So if we're looking at a 0 to 15 second exertion phase, we're not going to see a lot of fatigue accumulation, and we're not going to see a lot of fatigue byproduct accumulation within the muscles. The lactate capacity testing or the anaerobic fatigue resistance testing is going to be that middle to longer duration test. These are, again, sprint specific tests, but they're going to last about 15 to 90 seconds in duration. And these are the tests where you start to see much more muscular fatigue. You might even see nausea if you've ever conducted a Wingate test or 30-second test on a cycling ergometer. You'll notice that it's usually a pretty unpleasant sensation. And the last test is an aerobic capacity test, where we're looking at oxygen utilization. These tests are going to be generally over 90 seconds in duration. Typically, we're looking at 3 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or even further. But ultimately, with those tests, we're trying to see how vigorously you can exert yourself without a lot of lactate accumulation or without a lot of anaerobic fatigue byproduct accumulation. So those 3 qualities are assessed predominantly in the UCI power profile test. Now, this is a testing protocol that found its heritage in cycling, specifically in track cycling. The International Cycling Union, or UCI, uses the Wattbike as their official testing tool to assess peak power, 30-second sprinting ability, and 4-minute aerobic ability. With the peak power test, this is a relatively short test. So they'll conduct 2 6-second peak power tests, and they'll track the peak power and the peak cadence. Now, the reason they do it 2 times is because it's a relatively short test. So it's easy to botch one of the tests, especially if you haven't done it before. So we give the athlete 2 opportunities to try. Now, we're looking not only at the peak power, which occurs right at the beginning of the test, typically within about the first 1 3/4 revolutions, but also at the peak cadence, which happens a little bit later into the test, depending upon the amount of load that you're using. Typically, that could be anywhere from 2 to 4 seconds into the test. So in track cycling, you have a single speed bike with a fixed gear, and this test is designed to replicate the ability to start and the ability to wind up to a high cadence and to sustain power at that high cadence. Similar attributes are evaluated in the 30-second test. The 30-second test is still a maximal test, but this time we're not only recording the peak power, but we're also recording the mean power and the mean cadence. So basically we're looking at the averages. We want to see how long and how far this athlete can push him or herself until they reach total fatigue. With this test, we also evaluate a fatigue factor. And the fatigue factor is the percent decay from the highest 5-second average to the lowest 5-second power average within the test. So the highest 5 seconds is obviously going to be at the beginning of the test. The lowest 5 seconds will be at the end of the test, especially if this test is being performed to a true maximum. And we want to see the smallest fatigue factor possible. So if this is being expressed as a percentage, an elite athlete could have a fatigue factor of, let's say, 35%, and a deconditioned athlete could display a fatigue factor of 50 or even 60%. Obviously, the more resilient this athlete can be to fatigue, the better they're going to be within their sport in the majority of cases. The 4-minute aerobic test is a spin-off of one of the other popular watt bike tests, which is the 3-minute maximum minute power test. The reason this test is 4 minutes in nature is to replicate the pursuit event in track cycling. So that's both a team and individual event. There's 2 different versions of it, but both of them are about 4 minutes in duration. So this test evaluates the cyclist's aptitude to be able to perform 4 minutes of maximal exertion, or basically how long they can go without accumulating too much anaerobic fatigue to be able to complete the full race. Loading recommendations. Now, for the UCI power profile tests, the loading recommendations are standardized. So based upon the athlete's weight, we're able to choose which air resistance setting, or in some cases, magnetic resistance setting we're going to need to use for that test. Now, you'll notice out of the entire chart here, there's only one body weight that requires additional magnetic resistance. And the reason for that is the air resistance is a lot smoother than most other resistance mechanisms on the bike. So these air resistances correlate with the values that we're trying to see within the talent identification benchmarks, which we'll get into in just a moment. So you'll notice that for endurance athletes, we're using this table to determine an air resistance setting. However, for sprint-specific cyclists, we're using a standardized air resistance regardless of body mass or weight. So for elite male sprinters, we're using air resistance of 9 on the Wattbike Pro model. For the sprint test, which would be the 6-second peak power and the 30-second sprint test, and we're using an air resistance of 5 for the endurance test, and the endurance test would be that 4-minute aerobic test. For elite female sprinters, we're using air resistance 5 on the Pro model for the sprint test and 3 for the endurance test. So why is it important to define the testing parameters beyond just the duration? Why don't we just say, let's do a 6-second test and evaluate the outcome regardless of load? The truth is, the changes in loading are going to very significantly affect the testing results. As a generalization, the heavier loads are going to increase the muscular stress, while the lighter loads emphasize a little bit more of a neuromuscular, or in the longer tests, cardiorespiratory stress. So the lighter loads typically require increased coordination or technical proficiency with cycling. If you're an elite level cyclist, you may fare better at the higher cadences and lighter resistances, whereas an inexperienced cyclist or someone with poor cycling technical proficiency might struggle to maintain high cadences while still producing high rates of force. This is the power cadence resistance relationship table for the Wattbike Pro model. So these values are rounded to the nearest 5 watts and the nearest 5 revolutions per minute. The cadences listed on the left are the revolutions per minute at which the rider has to pedal. The air resistances at the top are air resistances only and do not include any additional magnetic resistance. And all of the values in the middle are the estimated power outputs at that particular cadence and load combination. So if you're trying to structure a workout and you know that you want to hit 300 watts and you know you need to be at 90 revolutions per minute to create the desired training effect, we need to be on air resistance level 6. Now, the test or the table goes up to 1045 watts. The capability for power measurement on the Wattbike is 3760 watts. So this table doesn't include any of the additional magnetic resistances. The magnetic resistance is less predictable in nature. So because it is a fluidly winding dial, we're not able to estimate as precisely what kind of effect that's going to have. However, we do have a good idea of it, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So for the UCI power profile test, the UCI has developed talent identification benchmarks. Now, these range from a normal recreational cyclist all the way up to an elite World Cup or World Championship competitor. These are broken down into duration, gender, and they're evaluating the power to weight ratios and the cadences, both peak and mean cadences. So you'll see for the 6-second peak power test, a recreational female cyclist is typically going to see a power to weight ratio in the 6 to 9 watts per kilo range. An elite female sprinter is typically going to see a power to weight ratio in the 18.5 to 19.5 watts per kilo peak range. Now, the caveat is, in order to produce that power, you have to have the ability to create a lot of torque on the low end. So you have to be able to get on top of the load and accelerate it very quickly. That peak power is occurring within the first 1, maybe 1.5 seconds of the test, whereas the peak cadence, which you'll see on the far right column, is going to be exhibited a little bit later. So depending upon the load you're using, and if you're a female sprinter, you're going to be using air resistance level 5 for this test, you should expect to wind up to about 160 to 165 revolutions per minute. Now, in the 30-second test, obviously the values are a little bit lower because the test takes a little bit longer. So we're looking at the median cadences and the mean power that the athlete is able to sustain throughout that full 30-second period. So at the elite level, 10 watts per kilo and 140 to 145 mean cadence, those are going to be extremely challenging values. Those are typically conducted by people that are fully locked into the bike using cycling specific shoes and who have been cycling for a long enough period of time to develop a high level of technical proficiency. These benchmarks can still be used for athletes in other sports. However, we're typically not seeing ground-based athletes up in the elite category, with few rare exceptions, of course. We're typically seeing most athletes within the developmental to junior range. That's okay. The main thing is that we're able to gather this data and we have something to compare it to, so we know what the benchmarks are and we know what's popular. We have a similar table available for male athletes, and you'll notice that since the resistances, the recommendations for the tests are a little bit different for male athletes, we're going to see slightly different cadence expectations for the elite level. So for the 6-second peak power test, not only would an elite male sprinter be exhibiting about 23.5 to 25.5 watts per kilo peak power output, but they'd also be seeing a slightly higher cadences. In order to achieve that kind of power, you typically need to be able to hit about 165 to 170 revolutions per minute. Now, those cadences are getting very high, especially for non-cycling athletes. So that brings up the question of, if the test is 6 seconds long, but most ground-based athletes aren't going to be able to get up to 165 or 170 revolutions per minute on a bike, do we need to complete the full 6 seconds? The answer in a lot of cases is probably no. We do have an abbreviated version of this test available, which is the peak power 3-second test, which is designed ultimately just to capture the peak power without necessarily winding up to the full peak cadence. The peak power, depending upon which leg you're starting with, is going to be captured around 1 to 1 3/4 pedal revolutions, whereas that peak cadence might not be a necessary measurement for what you're trying to accomplish with your OffFeet training and testing. So for ground-based athletes, we have some modified power profile testing protocols available. We offer a submaximal ramp test, and this test can be used as a warm-up because it is, again, submaximal in nature. So it winds the athlete up to about 70% of max exertion or 85% of max heart rate. This test is designed to estimate both maximum minute power, so it estimates the last stage that you would be able to get to on a full maximal ramp test, and it also provides a VO2 estimate through the Storer formula. Once you've completed the submaximal ramp test, you're able to develop a maximum minute power profile, which we'll get into a little bit, but you've also been warmed up as a result of this test. So you've developed your aerobic or cardiorespiratory fitness power value, and now you can go into your peak power and longer sprint testing. The peak power 6-second test is widely utilized in sports outside of cycling. In fact, just about every sport that's using the watt bike for some sort of off-feet training and testing is using the peak power test. The 30-second sprint test is, again, an expression of anaerobic capacity. So similar to the peak power 6-second test, this test is going to provide a peak power metric, but we're also looking at how the athlete fatigues under that longer maximal exertion. Additional testing options that we have available. We do have the ability to create customized time and distance tests. Now, as I mentioned before, we can do a peak power 3-second test. We could also do a 100-meter test or 200-meter test for alactic anaerobic exertion assessment. We could do an anaerobic capacity test, which could be a 500-meter test or a 60-second test. And we can do additional aerobic capacity or cardiorespiratory fitness assessments, like the 3-minute maximum minute power test, 20-minute functional threshold power test, a full maximal ramp test, or a 10-minute health assessment. Now, one of the reasons we typically shy away from the 3-minute maximum minute power test, the 20-minute functional threshold power test, and the maximal ramp test in ground-based sport training and testing is because these tests are maximal in nature. And if your sport doesn't require 3 minutes of maximal exertion, it might not be worth exerting yourself for 3 minutes maximally on the watt bike when you don't have to. We're still able to get an estimate of that maximum minute power value through the submaximal ramp test without having to cause additional fatigue, which could impact the rest of your training cycle by doing a 3-minute maximal test or 20-minute maximal test. These tests are absolutely the most taxing in terms of total energy expenditure out of all of the watt bike tests available. So velocity-based training. This is obviously a crude slide, but it's definitely one of the most valuable slides in this entire presentation. Velocity-based training has received a lot of notoriety lately because it works. The velocities that you see in the left-hand column are bar speed velocities. So typically these are going to be barbell movements like a squat, deadlift, clean, or snatch. The physical qualities in the middle are the qualities that are developed as a result of moving the barbell at the velocities on the left. And the cadences on the right are the comparable cadences to the velocities that you see in the left-hand column. So you'll notice that absolute strength at 0.25 to 0.6 meters per second has a corresponding cadence range of 15 to 35 revolutions per minute. Now, on the watt bike, the chances of riding at 15 to 35 revolutions per minute are low. And the reason for that is all of these velocities assume maximal exertion. So you not only need to be moving at 0.25 to 0.6 meters per second, but you need to be doing that with absolute maximal intensity. And the watt bike isn't able to produce enough load to be able to pedal at 15 revolutions per minute with maximal intensity in most cases. So we start to work our way further down the chart. And as we get into some of the more usable cadences, we look at speed strength, explosive strength, and ballistic speed. Now, as we're getting into the 90 to 105 revolution per minute cadence range, these are cadences that are realistic and can be accommodated using the resistances available on the watt bike. So the ultimate target in your training has to be knowing exactly what you're training for, knowing which physical qualities you're trying to develop and being very intentional with that. Down below, you'll see some of the higher cadences. Typically in ground-based athletes, we're looking at peak cadences of probably 180, even up to 200 revolutions per minute, but you won't see many athletes without a very high cycling technical proficiency achieving cadences beyond that. So most of the work that we're going to be doing is going to range from that 70 revolutions per minute to about 180 revolutions per minute range. So this brings up the two different ways that you can structure your conditioning or your additional training on the bike after you've completed your initial baseline assessments. There's peak percentage-based training, which is taking a percentage of your absolute peak output from, let's say, a 6-second or 30-second test, and using that as a guideline for all of your future power development or conditioning sessions. And there's maximum minute power and functional threshold power zone-based training. These are definitely most suitable for conditioning style efforts, and they typically work best with lower intensity zones. Maximum minute power and maximum heart rate. So the maximum minute power is the highest full stage that you would be able to complete in a full maximal ramp test. So if you conduct a maximal ramp test, and this should last, let's say, 16 to 20 minutes, that last full stage that you're able to complete is your maximum minute power. As we were going through those other testing options before, you also saw the 3-minute maximum minute power option. The average pace that you're supposed to be able to sustain for 3 minutes of maximal exertion is equal to this maximum minute power stage. So based off of that value, we can create a training zone chart. So you'll notice that recovery zone is anything below 35% of your maximum minute power. So that's going to be very low intensity riding, and it has a very low corresponding heart rate range. And as we get up into the supramaximal range, this is anything beyond 100% of your maximum minute power. Now, if your maximum minute power is a power output that you can sustain for 3 minutes, obviously there's going to be higher power outputs that you can sustain for shorter durations, like 6 seconds, 30 seconds, or even 1 minute. So once we get beyond that supramaximal range, or once we cross into that supramaximal threshold, we can no longer evaluate what kind of intensity the athlete is exerting, which becomes problematic for sprint style training. Now, with conditioning, we can still look into those middle zones. So we can look into the intensive, maximal, and threshold zones, and we can see exactly which quality we're developing by riding at each intensity and by keeping our heart rate within each given range. But once we get beyond 100% of that maximum minute power value, we're lost. Functional threshold power and functional threshold heart rate are values that are predominantly utilized by endurance athletes. These aren't even utilized by sprint athletes and by field athletes or ground-based athletes as often because they're very general. And again, they leave out that top end range. So with the functional threshold power and functional threshold heart rate zones, a lot of the time you end up working in values that exceed 100%. As you'll notice, in order to push up your lactate threshold, we're looking at percentages of 91 to 105%, 95% to 100% in terms of the heart rate and power outputs, which can get confusing, especially as you get into some of the short, even more vigorous efforts like the 10-second, 20-second, and 30-second sprints. With the percentage-based training structure, the pros of using percentages of your absolute peak power are that they work well for gauging high intensity efforts. So if you know that your 10-second maximum power output is 1,000 watts, it's easy to determine what 90% of that is. And when you start using this type of percentage-based training structure, it's very similar to the way you use it in weight training or resistance training. You know which loads are going to give you the desired training effect, and you try to base your training and testing within those zones. The cons of this training style are that when you get into the lower intensity efforts, so zone 6 and below, you tend to blur energy systems. And what I mean by that is if you're using the Wattbike for conditioning, and again, you have that 10-second maximum output average of 1,000 watts, if you want to condition at 50% of that, 60% of that, or 40% of that, when you're using those 40, 50, or 60% values, you're crossing multiple training zones, which, as you saw on the slide previous, will exhibit multiple different training effects. So you might do one effort at 40%, which will basically just develop regular sustainable effort. And you might be working at 50% and developing threshold, and then pushing up into the VO2 zone as you get up into the 60% range. So an example of a percentage-based training session, to clarify this a little bit, let's say your maximum 6-second power average is 1,000 watts. If you want to develop power, you might do 5 6-second efforts with 3 minutes of recovery between each. And I use the term power development loosely. This is basically developing sprinting ability. So we want to perform these efforts with high intensity, and we want ample rest in between to allow for complete or near complete recovery. So if your targeted effort intensity is 90% of your 6-second max, we're going to be working at 900 watts for all 5 of those efforts. Now, if you're using the percentage-based training style for your conditioning, we might be doing, let's say, 3 blocks of 5 by 6 efforts on, 54 seconds off with 3 minutes between those blocks. Let's say the intensity we want to use for those efforts is 50% of your max. So 50% of that 1,000 watt average would be 500 watts. Now, the problem with that is we don't know exactly where that 500 watts falls within the maximum minute power and functional threshold power zones, which means we don't know exactly what type of training effect that's going to elicit. Zone-based training. One of the pros of this is it works well for low to moderate intensity efforts. So if you're doing anything up to zone 6, it allows you to easily distinguish your desired training effect. So by looking at the charts on the previous page, you can see which effort is going to exhibit a cardiorespiratory development effect, which is going to allow you to push up your lactate threshold, which is going to push up your ventilatory threshold. However, again, once we get into that supramaximal intensity range, we aren't able to continue defining what kind of training effect we're going to get. So if you prescribe to your athlete a bunch of supramaximal efforts, those could be anything from just above 100% of maximum minute power all the way up to 2 or even 250% of that maximum minute power value. So with the zone-based training, let's say you have a maximum minute power of 400 watts. If you're prescribing a conditioning session, this could be 3 blocks of 5 by 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off with, again, 3 minutes between blocks. And the effort intensity could be 105% of your maximum minute power on and 35% of that maximum minute power off. Now, with that chart, we know that 105% of the maximum minute power is going to exert the qualities, or it's going to help develop the qualities listed in that supramaximal category. However, we don't know how much is enough, and it's hard to continue gauging beyond that. So it gets really messy when you start prescribing efforts that are 140, 160, or even 200% of maximum minute power. Those values don't make sense. So for conditioning, it works well because you can say something like, we're going to do 420 watts on, 140 watts off for the prescribed durations. However, for sprint-specific training, we're not able to gauge those efforts appropriately anymore. So why is it important to test your athletes maximally? Really, the body will conserve energy whenever possible. So if you're testing at submaximal intensities, and this implies primarily to sprint style efforts, the body's not going to fire everything unless it has to. So if you're sprinting and you're doing a 6-second effort, if you sprint at 100%, you can guarantee that everything's engaging. However, if you sprint at 80%, which would still be considered a supramaximal intensity, but not your absolute perceived maximum, there's a chance that you might be conserving a little bit of energy, and we're not going to get the same biofeedback that we normally would when the athlete is sprinting maximally. So what does this mean? If you take an elite level track cycling sprinter, when they sprint maximally, you should see a polar view image or a technique image or force curve like the ones we saw before in the optimal range. So you should see a smooth revolution with fluid transitions over the bottom and the top of the pedaling revolution, and you should see strong force application through both the pushing and pulling phases. Now, many elite sprinters exhibit pretty poor pedaling technique when they're pedaling at submaximal intensities. So even though this athlete may be capable of exhibiting perfect pedaling technique when they're sprinting for 10, 15, or 20 seconds, their polar view image may look poor when they're pedaling in zone 1 or zone 2 for 5 or 10 minutes at a time. So to summarize what we've discussed today, OffFeet protocols require a process, and the process involves establishing baselines and continuously assessing those baselines. So when we establish baselines, we need to choose the testing parameters that align with that initial performance matrix. So if the qualities that are important to you consist of aerobic capacity, lactate capacity, and peak power production ability, we choose tests that correspond with those values. Training intentionally. We need to choose a training program that allows us to develop the qualities that are important to us within that training matrix. Reassessing regularly is easy when you have a lot of data available. So through the Wattbike, when you have load data, power data, cadence data, and a lot of real-time biofeedback through the polar view and pedaling effectiveness score, we're able to constantly monitor the progress that's being made, especially if frequent maximal reassessments are being conducted. And lastly, evaluating technique trends is a lot easier to do chronically or over long periods of time. As Paul discussed within the previous webinars, load management is becoming much more of a highly discussed topic within the sporting communities, and deciphering what's important can be difficult. Through the Wattbike and through the pedaling technique data, we're able to identify balances or imbalances very easily, and we're able to assess those over time. So if we test initially and the athlete has a 52-48 left-right balance and they're exhibiting poor pedaling technique, but then 3 months later we test them again and they're right on a 50-50 power balance left to right leg and their polar view image looks much better, we know that the training intervention that we're implementing is effective. However, if we're seeing worsening of the pedaling technique or the left-right balance, that may indicate some other issues, whether those are acute or chronic. That's up to the coach to ultimately determine. So this is where we'll open it up for questions. Today's presentation was obviously kept relatively vague. There's a lot to discuss and there's a lot that goes into training and testing OffFeet. However, I'd like to open up this opportunity for some sport-specific questions. So if you're a sport coach dealing with a certain population of athletes, whether it's a certain age or just a specific sport, I'm more than willing to answer away.
Well, I think, first of all, thank Thompson. This is a great presentation. A lot of good information. I'm sure a lot of people have to digest a lot of it as well. How much do you use heart rate with this data? Is it looking at mainly just the wattage, or how much you want to focus on heart rate?
So heart rate is definitely one of the other most important parameters. The reason it wasn't discussed as much in this presentation is because many coaches, especially in team environments, don't have access to heart rate data. So power data is going to give us a very small measuring scale. We're able to break down watts into very small increments, and we know which zones correspond with which physical developments. Now, when we add heart rate to it, that gives us a full another layer. So when we move into the conditioning style workouts, if we're using power as our target, but we're monitoring heart rate the entire time, let's say we want to try to keep the heart rate in zone 2 throughout the entire conditioning session, we can monitor that even though the intervals might be at all different power intensities. We can see if we can keep the heart rate within the desired range for the entirety of that session.
Okay, great. Hold on here. I've got a couple other questions here. Zach, I unmuted you, So you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, gotcha.
So I was curious as to during a competitive season, whether it be hockey, baseball, how often would you retest a 6-second peak power?
This is something that can be reassessed very, very frequently. We have teams that have tried to do it every single day. Obviously, that may be overkill in a lot of cases because of accommodation. However, avoiding accommodation is possible through load manipulation. So, in theory, you could test the peak power weekly or even 2 times a week, as long as you're using constantly varied loads. Now, as you use multiple different loads, you can establish a full power profile for that athlete. So you'll note what their power outputs are and what their peak cadences are on, let's say, air resistance 2, air resistance 6, air resistance 10, and maybe even air resistance 10 and magnetic resistance 5. So after you develop a huge profile of testing data, you can see where the athlete is excelling and where they need to work a little bit more. And this ties back into the velocity-based training. So you'll typically notice that some of the bigger, stronger athletes typically see the best peak power outputs at heavy loads. We notice this a lot in rugby and hockey. Some of the lighter athletes or the less muscular athletes typically see the best power outputs around the lighter resistances and the significantly higher cadences. In light cyclists, we typically see some of the best power outputs at really, really light loads. Let's say fan 2 to 4. Big rugby players might see their best power outputs around fan 10 or even 10 and some additional magnet.
Okay, thank you.
Josh, I saw you raised your hand. I got you unmuted if you want to ask a question. There we go.
No, sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay, I'm sorry. Carrie, I see that Carrie has some questions, so mute her. Carrie. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we go.
Great. Yeah, I just had a question. I'm planning to test a group of athletes, some speed skaters. And the main purpose of the testing is to determine their training zones. They spend a lot of time on their road bikes during the summer months, working on just conditioning, working on their aerobic capacity. So we were planning to do the 20-minute FTP test. Would you say that's the best test to use for that circumstance?
A lot of this will depend upon their specific event duration. Typically, the 20-minute test isn't advised for non-cycling athletes just because of the exertion required for that type of effort. We can essentially figure out very similar values through that submaximal ramp test. So when we're conducting the submax ramp test, we take the athlete up to an RPE of 7 or 85% of the max heart rate, and that allows us to estimate very closely the maximum minute power. Now, the maximum minute power is 140% of your functional threshold power. So if you know your maximum minute power, you know your functional threshold power as well. So if you are purely trying to test their fortitude for 20 minutes of exertion, then it could definitely be a good idea. However, if there's other training priorities that you want to focus on or other testing parameters that you want to try to get through and still have your athletes stay relatively fresh for those, there are ways to work around that without necessarily having to conduct that test.
Okay. And with the submaximal ramp test, that's just, you do the 1 minute stages, is that correct?
Correct. So the stages are 1 minute in duration. You can choose the starting stage, so you could standardize it for all of your athletes. However, as you set up a profile within the bike or within the Wattbike hub, it will provide a starting stage recommendation and a ramp increase recommendation based upon the user's age, gender, weight, and ability level. So if you want all of your athletes to be testing off of the same parameters, you could start everyone at, let's say, 100 watts and increase by 15 watts every minute until they reach that 85% of their maximum heart rate mark. or you could use the preset resistance recommendations and preset power target recommendations, and you'll still get ultimately the same effect.
Okay, and so that's all done through the hub, the Wattbike hub.
Yes, the protocol is available within the Wattbike monitor itself. It is a little bit more tedious to set up in there. One of the advantages of using the Wattbike hub for that is the display is a little bit easier to read. The polar view image on there is color coded, and you do have the ability to track and store that data within a cloud-based platform. Now, if you have a lot of high-profile athletes or athletes who just don't want to share their data, you can privatize your profile on there as well, so no one will have access to it.
Gotcha. Okay. And then my other question was heart rate monitors. Can you use any heart rate monitor with the Wattbike? Do they sync with other brands or?
The best heart rate monitors to use are going to be the standard ANT plus transmission heart rate monitors with the Pro and Trainer models. We just launched 2 new models, the Pro Trainer touchscreen and the Atom X. Those do work with Bluetooth heart rate. However, for the traditional Pro Trainers, which are the majority of the bikes available in the US right now, those work best with a standard ANT plus chest strap.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Jason, I unmuted you. You got a question?
Yes, we currently use a modified 3-second power test with our athletes. And I'm just curious, when comparing subsequent tests, so we currently test once a month, what would be a meaningful increase or decrease in their power output? So when will we need to raise the red flag or adjust training, or when do we know it's going the right direction?
Good question. What sport is this for?
Baseball.
Baseball? Okay. So in baseball, you're typically using the 3-minute test for aerobic capacity assessment or oxygen utilization. So to break it down, anything outside of the sport itself, when we're discussing OffFeet training and testing, is going to be considered general physical training. With that taken into consideration, the test is basically designed to see how much work your athlete can do and how efficiently and effectively they can utilize oxygen, and basically what their training foundation is. So how they're going to be able to get through the rest of their training cycle. So if you don't have to implement a 3-minute test for an athlete in a specific ball sport or power ball sport like baseball, it's probably best not to, unless you have a very specific reason for doing so. Now,
we use the 3-second power test. Sorry.
3-second test. Okay, sorry, I thought you said 3-minute test.
No, sorry.
So with the 3-second test, that one can be conducted very frequently. It can be conducted on a variety of different loads. And again, that one's going to be highly dependent upon that athlete's strength profile. So bigger athletes will typically fare better on the heavier loads. Lighter athletes are typically going to fare better on the lighter loads. Ultimately, it's going to come down to developing, again, that power profile. So using multiple different resistances on a frequent basis, you should be able to see a correlation between your increased power production abilities and your increased strength production abilities in the weight room carrying over to the bike testing. So if you're intervening with weight training and other formats of power training and then conducting ongoing Wattbike training, you should be able to see those values go up pretty consistently over time.
Okay, so that if we retest, say we test athlete between test 1 and test 2, they had a say 3% drop in peak power. Would that be like meaningful, or would that be more just like a daily fluctuation of their general readiness? And like, so how big of a difference will we need to see before we are somewhat alarmed that they're decreasing their power output?
Were both of those tests conducted on the same load settings?
Yes.
Okay. And what was the time between testing sessions?
1 month.
1 month. So would you consider this athlete to be technically proficient with cycling? Do they ride the bike enough to feel comfortable with it?
I probably not. Would they be technically sufficient? No. or proficient.
And would you say that they started the test in the exact same position? So the crank arms were in the same exact position relative to the ground, and their setup was identical in terms of saddle height, handlebar height, and saddle and handlebar fore and aft.
Setup was identical. As far as where they start with the crank arms, as far as feet position, I would probably say no, but I'm not sure.
Okay. The repeatability element is very dependent upon setting up as many elements of the test as identically as possible. So in order to produce the best, most repeatable and reliable results, we want to make sure that the crank arms are set up at the exact same starting point for every maximal peak power test. So typically you're going to see the best results with the front crank arm or the front legs crank arm just above parallel to the ground. So you're typically looking at about 20 to 30 degrees above parallel to the ground, and then stomping on the pedals to create that initial peak output. The peak power output will come very quickly within that test. So if you go into the bike's monitor and you look at the data revolution by revolution, you'll see that the data for the peak power, that metric is typically coming within the first 2 revolutions of the test.
Okay.
So to answer your question, seeing a bit of a drop off could be sort of a fluke. So it could be just a discrepancy in the testing setup. If you're testing frequently on the same load, you could see accommodation. So if you're always using the same loading parameters for the test, you might see just an adaptation and a slight fading. So that's where the load variation becomes very, very important. But ultimately, consistent exposure to the testing protocol will keep them more technically proficient. So they'll stay more comfortable with the bike, and it'll become a better indicator of power production ability as they get more familiar with the piece of equipment. Just like using a barbell, the more you squat, the better you're going to be able to do it in terms of technique. Same goes for riding. Even though it's a relatively simple movement and it's fixed, there is still just enough technique that comes into play to allow it to become a much better testing tool.
Well, thank you.
All right, we got a few more. Get some more time, Thompson?
Absolutely.
Okay, William, I unmuted you, so you raised your
Great.
hand. There you go.
Yeah, so my question is probably a little bit different. So I am a phys ed and health teacher in a high school, and we have about 6 Wattbikes, and we're just trying to figure out the best way to involve them in our fitness unit. And they're obviously an amazing piece of equipment that can give you a lot of data. And my question is just, what do you think is the most simplest way we could use them in a classroom setting, or just getting started with using them very simply?
So one of the easiest things to do initially would be a technique development session. So go through an orientation session on the bikes to get the kids familiar with setting up the bike at the proper saddle and handlebar height and fore and aft, and show them how to manipulate the resistance on the bike. Once they feel comfortable with the bike and they see how the loading affects the power output on the screen, they can start working on developing that polar view image. So they can pay attention to the real-time force curve that they're seeing on the screen, and they can focus on trying to create more efficient power throughout the pedaling revolution. And this can be done at a really low intensity, so it doesn't require maximal exertion or any additional special preparation. It just involves getting the kids on the bike and getting them really comfortable with it. Once they feel comfortable with the bike and they're familiar with it enough to use it as maybe a warm-up tool prior to a strength training session or sports session, then we can start implementing some more of the tests where it requires a little bit more concentrated effort and a lot more focus. So technique sessions and orientation sessions are absolutely the way to start.
Great, awesome. And just one more quick question about that. About the curve being able to generate on the bike, you talked about that briefly. Is it without shoes, let's just say without shoes and being able to hook up to the bike, you're not going to be able to generate as much, or that perfect, those 2 circles that you're trying to generate? Is it just, and if we don't have access to those, or just and I'm able to get them, are you still able, is it still possible to make that curve or get close to it with just really good technique?
Definitely. The bikes do come equipped with toe cages. So as long as you secure your feet very firmly within the toe cages, it is absolutely possible to produce that shape. Now, obviously, it's going to be easier to produce it if you are wearing a cycling specific shoe, but we do have quite a few athletes globally who have produced very high peak power numbers with very, very close to optimal technique in tennis shoes and toe cages. Now, as you're pedaling with the toe cages, it's going to be important to make sure that they're strapped in tightly enough to be able to feel yourself sweeping through the bottom of the revolution and pulling up through the hip flexor over the top of the revolution to create the smooth transitions. But you will be able to see that reflected in the polar view image. So once you get very comfortable applying pressure in that particular pattern, then you will get to the point where if you become a skilled cyclist or even just an athlete who's very comfortable with the Wattbike, you can exhibit similar pedaling techniques without being strapped in at all. However, it does take a while to get to that point.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
And you wouldn't necessarily want to do that either. Obviously, you want to be locked in to get the full advantage. Just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done.
Gotcha. Yep. Thank you again.
I think we're going to take a couple more here. I unmuted Jason. Or I'm sorry, was that Jason that time? Brian then.
Yes, how's it sound? I would like to know with regards to testing for preseason base training for marathon and half marathon runners, would you rather use a max ramp test or the sub max test?
It depends upon what you're trying to get out of it. If it's an experienced athlete who's comfortable with the bike and comfortable with maximal or near maximal exertion, then the maximal ramp test could definitely pertain. The submaximal ramp test is an easy way to reassess on an ongoing basis without interfering with the rest of training. So if you're doing some preseason testing or you're about to start a training cycle and you need to establish a new baseline, the maximal ramp test could absolutely be implemented. As you're trying to reassess that and just trying to make sure everything's on track, you can use the submaximal ramp test to gauge progress, or you can use the 10-minute health assessment test, which is another test found both in the monitor of the bike and on the app, which ultimately asks you to stay within a certain power and heart rate zone. And if you're unable to stay within the proper heart rate zone, you'll know that something is going awry with your training. So you'll know that if you're putting out, let's say, 200 watts, you should be at a heart rate of 145 beats per minute. Now, if you're deviating from that and you're starting to drift up to 150 or 153 beats per minute, something's off. Maybe you're under recovered, overtrained, or something else is going on with your training.
No, perfect. Thank you.
And then Steve.
Yes. Was that the one with the question I emailed through? Firstly, thank you. Has been a very interesting and informative talk. My question relates to more your opinion on peak angle of force in lower cadences, and if you've had any experience around injury to knee joint or any trauma because of the excessive amount of torque. Was that question clear?
That's a very good question. For those of you who aren't familiar, the angle of peak force that he's referring to is essentially a moment arm within the force curve that's showing where the most force is being applied within that particular pedal revolution. So typically we see changes within that angle of peak force by changes in position. So what I mean by changes in position, usually it's going to be hand position on the handlebars or bike setup. So if you're riding with your hands on the hood of the handlebars, so the part that protrudes where a normal brake lever would be on a road bike, you're going to see, in most cases, an angle of peak force between about 90 to 100 degrees. Now, as you start to move into the drops, or if you start to push your arms way out onto the arrow or tri-bar extensions, you'll typically see that angle starting to drop down into the 120, maybe even 125 degree range. Now, if you bring your hands back up to the top flat portion of the handlebar where you're sitting nearly upright, you'll see that angle rise back up to about 90 degrees, some cases even higher. So this is going to be a heavy influence on how the force is being applied into the pedals. So by changing the way in which you're sitting, you can change the angle of peak force that's being exerted into the cranks. Now, in sports where the athletes stand to produce power, for example, track cycling or BMX cycling, you may see similar angles of peak force between standing and using an extended arrow type position. But ultimately, we're not as concerned about those values within the session itself. We're more concerned with the chronic trends that are displayed through those peak angles. And by that, I mean, if you look at your angle of peak force during a strong 20-second test or a strong 3-minute test, and then you continue training over time and you test again, and you notice that the power value changed and the angle of peak force and the technique image changed, you may be able to indicate whether the training is progressing positively or negatively based upon the correlation between the power output and that angle of peak force.
Okay. So an extension of the question then would be, if this trend in a lot of the, I'm going to call it the age group training, and it's trendy training, is this torque type training where they're grinding out a gear over a long period of time. The torque is high, the cadence is low, and they end up with a peak angle of force dropping below the 90-degree mark. Have you experienced anything along those lines that would lead to trauma, injury, or any inflammation around the knee joint or anything like that?
At this time, we don't have any specific research on that. That's a good topic to look into. However, at this time, we don't have any conclusive data on that.
No, I'm finding the same thing. I just found your talk interesting. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we got one last one. Roland, got a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so my question really related towards like what you were saying with the high school athletes, and how it is that you have kind of restricted the load settings as such, or given parameters to the coaches, so to prevent injury in the younger athletes, obviously with their developing ligaments, muscle, tissue, etc. Have you kind of set any sort of parameters for athletes and, coaches in those areas?
So the lighter resistance recommendations are the ones found in the chart for the UCI power profile test. So those resistance recommendations are designed to be safe for athletes of all ages. They're much more dependent upon the athlete's ability to produce power at high cadences than produce a lot of torque and absolute strength. So ultimately, the lighter the load, generally speaking, the safer it'll be within a reasonable cadence range. However, again, once you start pushing up into the extreme cadences, so let's say 180, 190, 200 revolutions per minute, again, you start to introduce a little bit more potential injury risk. So it depends upon the duration of the effort you're doing. If you have a powerful but young athlete who may be able to produce beyond 180 revolutions per minute on the recommended load setting, then you might need to knock up that load a little bit to make sure that they stay within a safe and reasonable range. So it's going to be treated on a case-by-case basis. Those are recommendations only. Those aren't cut and dry. The bike does measure any force input regardless of load. So the load has no bearing on the actual power reading. So you can produce the same amount of power on fan 1 that you can on fan 10 if you can spin quickly enough to do so. So try to keep your athletes within a reasonable range. Race ranges for sprint cyclists are typically anywhere from 110 to 140 revolutions per minute. Once you start venturing way outside that, you start to introduce a little bit more risk of injury. Race ranges for endurance athletes, endurance cyclists and triathletes are typically closer to the 80 to 105 revolution per minute range, which are pretty easy to stay within.
Okay. And I mean, are you, in your opinion, are there any kind of like age parameters that you would be using for the bikes and the kids that are in the schools?
Generally speaking, as you're introducing someone to the bike, it's helpful to keep the cadences slightly on the higher side to develop that technical proficiency. So athletes are able to develop a little bit more technique and coordination by riding consistently at the higher cadences. So as a rule of thumb, we typically keep the cadences on the high side, or at least in line with the recommendations, until we see a need to do otherwise. And the need to do otherwise would be stemming from the desire to produce a different physical quality. So maybe the ability to produce a little bit more torque, but that's something that typically doesn't come into play until the athlete is a little bit more mature, and they're a little bit more familiar with the bike.
For sure. Well, thank you. This has been great, Thompson. Thank you very much, man.
Thank you.
Great session, great questions. I think we'll wrap it up now. Thompson, if you just want to bring it back over to me, so I'm chair, and then I will have everything out the next day or two. Tracy will make sure that we get everything to you guys, the link to this, so you can go back through the data that he's gone through. So thank everybody for being on, and look forward for your feedback so we can come up with some more series as well. So